It was the last night of summer. The wind howled outside as Max, now an adult, sat in the dimly lit interrogation room. The walls seemed to close in on him, the cold steel of the chair pressing against his back, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He was a suspect, a prime suspect in the brutal murders of his parents and younger sister, who had been killed almost 15 years ago. The memories of that night were still fresh in his mind, but now everything had turned upside down. How had it all come to this? How had he become the one they were pointing fingers at? The police had always suspected him, but over the years, they had never been able to prove anything. Now, though, they had evidence, or at least that was what they claimed. They said his fingerprints were all over the scene. They said there was a reason he had been the only one left alive, hiding in the closet, hearing his family screams. Max couldn't remember much of the details from that night. It had been dark, and the fear had gripped him so tightly that it was hard to separate the real from the imagined. But the one thing he would never forget was the hatred in the eyes of the man who had walked into his house that night. The man who had taken everything from him. He remembered hiding in the closet, hearing the thud of the door being kicked open, his mother's scream followed by the sickening sound of a body hitting the floor, his father's voice, the words muffled by the thumping of his heart in his ears. Then there was the cold silence. Max had been so scared he didn't dare move. The man had taken everything, his family, his sense of safety, and in the eyes of the world now it seemed his very innocence. But the worst part? That the killer had been someone who was supposed to protect them all. Max's mind flashed back to the past as he sat in the interrogation room, his hands trembling. He had been just 9 years old when the murders had happened. The small town they lived in had always been peaceful, quiet. No one could ever imagine anything like this happening in a place where everyone knew each other. It was late in the evening, the sky tinged with the warm glow of a setting sun. Max had been in his room, his nose buried in a book, when the shouting began. His father's voice, usually calm and collected, was raised in anger. Max had run to the door, his heart racing. It had started as an argument, but Max didn't know what about. Then the shouting became louder, the door slammed open, and he saw him, the man. A tall, imposing figure dressed in dark clothing, with eyes that burned with a cold fury. Max barely saw his face in the dim light, but it was enough. He could feel the hatred in the air, thick and suffocating. The man wasn't a stranger. Max recognized him. He had seen him around town, at the grocery store, at school events. A racial slur was shouted, loud and angry, and the words still echoed in Max's mind to this day. "Get out of my house, you filthy." The rest of the words were drowned out by the sound of the gunshot that rang through the house. The man had shot Max's father first. Max had heard the scream as his mother tried to protect her husband. She had screamed his name before she fell. Max had clutched the door frame, watching in terror as his family fell one by one. Then silence. Max was pulled back to the present as a detective's voice broke through his thoughts. "You were in that closet, weren't you, Max?" Max swallowed hard. He nodded but didn't speak. What else could he say? He had been there, hidden in the shadows, too afraid to make a sound. His heart had been pounding in his chest as the man had gone through the house, ransacking everything, looking for something, or maybe just enjoying the destruction. When the man had finally left, Max had crawled, let out of the closet, his legs shaking, his body trembling. He had tried to wake his family, but it was too late. They were gone. And yet, for all these years, no one had ever been arrested for the crime. Until now. Now, the detectives had turned their gaze on him. "Max, we have evidence," the detective continued. "You were the only one alive. We got your fingerprints on the door frame, your blood at the scene. It all points to you." Max felt his stomach twist. What was happening? How had things gone so wrong? He had been just a child who had witnessed the unthinkable, a child who had survived when no one else had. He had been hiding in that closet for hours, terrified, and now they were accusing him of murder? The detective was watching him, waiting for a response. Max's mouth went dry. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. How could he explain what had happened when he didn't even understand it himself? "Max," the detective said, his voice softer now. "Do you want to tell us what happened that night?" Max stared at him, the weight of the years pressing down on him. He could feel the darkness of that night creeping into the present, threatening to swallow him whole. How had he gone from being the terrified child to being the one in the hot seat? As the silence stretched between them, the detective's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression turning serious. He looked at Max with a knowing glance. "We found something else," the detective said, his voice now sharp. "Something that changes everything." Max's heart skipped a beat. What did that mean? Before he could ask, the detective stood up and walked out of the room, leaving Max alone with his thoughts. What had the detective found? Would it clear his name? Or was this just the beginning of a nightmare he might never wake up from? To understand how Max had arrived at this moment, we need to go back to the very beginning. Back to when his life had been torn apart by hatred and violence. Max had always known that T. His world wasn't perfect. He had grown up in a town where racism simmered just below the surface. His parents had tried to shelter him from it, but Max had always felt different. He was the only mixed-race kid in his class, and the taunts and whispers followed him wherever he went. But it had never been so bad until that night. Max's father, a proud man, had worked as a mechanic at the local garage. His mother worked at the library. Both of them were well-liked by their community, despite the occasional sideways glance or muttered insult. But their quiet lives were shattered when a man, full of anger and hate, entered their home with a single purpose: to kill. Max's family had been targeted not just because of their race, but because they had dared to challenge the norms of a small town that refused to accept anyone who wasn't like them. Max had never seen the man's face clearly, but the hatred in his voice had been unmistakable. The man had blamed Max's father for everything that had gone wrong in his life. "You people think you're better than everyone else," the man had shouted, his voice full of rage. "We'll show you." And then the shots rang out. Max had hidden in the closet, his heart thudding in his chest, as the world outside turned to chaos. Now here he was sitting in a sterile room, accused of something he had never done. The same questions kept circling in his mind. How had they come to this? How had the killer been someone they all knew? But the truth was something Max could never have imagined. The truth was something that would change everything. And as the clock ticked on, Max's fate hung in the balance. What would the detective's discovery mean for him? Would it lead to his freedom, or would it seal his doom? The only thing Max knew for sure was that this nightmare was far from over.
Max sat in the cold, dimly lit room, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead the only sound in the silence. His mind was still reeling from the detective's words. "We found something else." What could that be? What did it mean? His heart raced in his chest as he waited for an answer that could change everything. The door to the interrogation room opened, and the detective reappeared, followed by another officer who was holding a file. The officer laid it down on the table in front of Max. He didn't say a word but exchanged a brief look with the detective before leaving the room. Max was alone again with the detective, whose expression had turned more serious. There was a quiet tension in the air as the detective opened the file and began flipping through the papers. Max's stomach twisted in knots. He had no idea what this new discovery was, but he feared it might be even worse than what had already happened. "Max," the detective began, his voice steady but with a hint of something else, curiosity, perhaps, or disbelief. "We've been going over everything again. The evidence from the crime scene, the reports, the testimonies. And there's something we missed all these years." Max leaned forward, trying to steady his breath, his palms sweating. He had to know. He had to understand what had changed. What did they find? The detective paused, letting the moment stretch, then pushed a photograph across the table toward Max. Max stared at the picture, his breath catching in his throat. It was a photo of the crime scene, but it wasn't the usual one he had seen 1,000 times before. This was different. This time, there was something Newa detail he hadn't noticed, something that had been overlooked all those years ago. It was a scrap of paper, torn, nearly burned at the edges, but still legible. And on that scrap of paper were 2 words, scrawled in black ink. "Get out." Max's mind aced. Those words seemed so familiar, like something from a dream or a nightmare, but he couldn't place it. He stared at the picture, trying to make sense of it. Why was this important? Why was this suddenly being brought to his attention? The detective spoke again, this time with more urgency. "This was found in the rubble, under some furniture. We never realized it before because we were focused on the larger pieces of evidence. But now, we think it might be a clue." Max's pulse quickened. A clue to what? The detective leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "We think the killer wasn't working alone." Max froze. "What? But I thought it was just him. The man who killed them. I saw him. I hid. We know you did, Max," the detective interrupted, his voice firm. "But there's something we didn't understand. Someone else must have been involved. The handwriting on this paper," he paused, tapping the photograph, "it's a match to someone who was close to your family." Max's mind was spinning. This was too much. He felt like he was suffocating in his thoughts. But who? Who could have been involved? The detective didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared at Max, studying him carefully. "Do you remember anyone from your family's life who might have had a grudge against them? Someone who had access to your home? Someone who might have been involved in something that could have led to this?" Max was silent for a moment. He had been so young back then, just a child. His memories were fragmented, distorted by fear and the trauma of that night. He remembered his father's friends, the people who had worked with him at the garage, but none of them had ever seemed dangerous. And his mother, she had always been so kind, so generous. But no one was perfect. The more Max thought, the more it gnawed at him. He remembered something else, something that he had tried to forget. The whispers. The hushed conversations his parents had when they thought he wasn't listening. The tension in the air when certain people came around. They had never said anything directly to him, but there had always been something unsettling about a few individuals in their circle. But there was one person who stood out, someone Max hadn't thought about in years. "Mr. Harris," Max said quietly, almost to himself. The detective's gaze flickered with recognition. "Go on." Max swallowed hard. "He used to come over sometimes. He was a friend of my dad's. Had talked to my mom sometimes, too. I never really understood what they were talking about, but it always seemed secretive. Like they were discussing something important. I think he used to work with my dad. He was always a little rough around the edges." "Mr. Harris," the detective muttered, nodding slowly. "Well, look into him. But listen, Max, we're not saying he was involved. Not yet. But this new information, it's pointing in a direction we didn't expect." Max's thoughts were a blur. Could it be true? Could someone so close to his family have been involved in something so terrible? He hadn't seen Mr. Harris in years, but the memories of those strange conversations returned to him like a shadow. "What happened to him?" Max asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The detective didn't answer immediately. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "Mr. Harris has been off the radar for a long time. But we're digging into his past. We need to find out what connections he had, and if he was involved in any way." Max's mind raced. What if the detective was right? What if Mr. Harris had been involved, and Max had missed the signs when he was just a child? But even if Mr. Harris was part of it, that didn't explain the most important question in Max's mind. Why would they accuse him now? Why would the police believe he had been the one to kill his own family? The detective stood up abruptly, pulling Max from his thoughts. "I'm going to leave you for a moment, Max. I know this is a lot to process, but I need you to stay here. We're going to continue this investigation, and we'll be in touch." As the detective walked out, Max was left alone again, but his thoughts were louder than ever. Was it possible that everything he thought he knew was wrong? Could someone he trusted be behind all of it? And why was he still the one being blamed? The door clicked shut, and Max sat there in the silence, waiting for the answers that seemed so far out of reach. What had really happened that night? And how could he prove that he wasn't the one responsible? As the hours dragged on, the questions continued to swirl in his mind, the uncertainty growing with each passing minute. The next day, Max was released, but only on the condition that he remain available for questioning. He was still considered a suspect, but the detective had told him that things were moving fast. As Max walked out of the police station, the world outside felt both familiar and foreign. The streets seemed unchanged, yet everything felt different now. He had always tried to move on from the tragedy of his childhood, but now, it felt like the past was catching up with him like a shadow that refused to let him go. Max had never been able to forget that night, but now, the mystery was deeper than ever. And as he walked into the bright daylight, he realized that the answers he so desperately needed might be closer than he thought. But who could he trust? The air felt different outside the police station, thick with uncertainty, like the calm before a storm. Max had never expected to be in this situation, never dreamed that years of silence would come crashing down on him like this. Every step he took seemed heavier than the last. He had been released for now, but the questions were piling up, and no matter how many times he replayed that night in his head, the answers remained elusive. The detective's words echoed in his mind, "We think the killer wasn't working alone." Could it be? Could someone have helped the man who killed his family? Max couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than he had ever known. And it terrified him. He didn't know where to go. His home felt empty, a place where the ghosts of his family lingered, and yet, it wasn't where he needed to be right now. Max needed answers, and the only way he could get them was by facing the past, no matter how painful it might be. He made his way to the small coffee shop on the corner of his street. It was a quiet place, the kind of cafe where people would read their papers or chat with friends, unaware of the turmoil swirling just below the surface. But today, Max was looking for something else, information. The bell above the door jingled as he walked inside. There was an elderly woman behind the counter, wiping down the counter as she looked up and gave him a warm smile. Max returned a half smile, the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. He ordered a coffee and sat at one of the corner tables, trying to gather his thoughts. As he stirred his drink, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from a number he didn't recognize. His fingers hesitated before he opened it. When he did, his stomach twisted. "I know what you're looking for, Max. Be careful who you trust." The message sent a chill down his spine. Who could have sent this? He hadn't told anyone he was investigating further. And yet, someone seemed to be watching him, someone who knew exactly what was going on. Max didn't respond to the message. He had a lot to process, and right now, he needed to focus. He had to find out more about Mr. Harris, the man who had come to mind when he saw the note from the crime scene. He didn't want to believe that Mr. Harris had been involved, but deep down, he knew it was possible. After all, he had been close to his family. And as Max had learned all too well, the people you trust the most can be the ones who betray you the hardest. He spent the next few hours researching everything he could find about Mr. Harris. The more he searched, the darker the picture became. Mr. Harris had been a friend of his father's, yes, but he had also been involved in some unsavory dealings. There were rumors about his business practices, rumors that Max's father had always brushed aside, telling his son that people loved to gossip. But now, those rumors felt like warnings. Max came across reports of a shady deal gone wrong, of threats made behind closed doors. It was all vague, fragmented information, but it was enough to make Max question everything he thought he knew. His fingers trembled as he clicked on one final Lincoln old news article from when Max was still a child. It was about a mysterious fire that had destroyed a warehouse on the outskirts of town. Mr. Harris had been the owner of the warehouse. The article didn't go into many details, but it hinted at foul play, arson, insurance fraud. Max's heart skipped a beat. The dots were starting to connect, but what did it all mean? Was Mr. Harris involved in his family's murder, or was he just another piece of the puzzle? Max felt a deep sense of unease settle in his chest. He needed more answers. He needed to speak to someone who knew Mr. Harris well, someone who could shed light on what was really going on. That night, Max made his way to the old mechanic garage where his father had worked. It was now a rundown place, barely staying afloat. The lights flickered, casting long shadows against the walls. Max knew the garage well. It had been his second home as a child. He had spent hours here, watching his father work, learning the trade, even helping out when he was old enough. He pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside, the smell of motor oil and rust filling his nose. The garage was deserted, save for a few old cars that had been left to rot. He walked through the rows of empty bays, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. He reached the back office, where his father had once sat with Mr. Harris, laughing over beers, discussing business. Max hadn't been in here since that night. He hesitated before knocking on the door. But just as his knuckles were about to tap against the wood, he heard a voice, soft and low, coming from the other side. "You shouldn't be here." Max's breath caught in his throat. He recognized the voice immediately. "Mr. Harris?" Max asked, his heart racing. The door creaked open, and there stood the man he had been searching for. He looked different now, older, worn, with a scruffy beard and tired eyes. But it was him. It was the same man who had been a fixture in his family's life, and now, Max was face to face with him. "Max," Mr. Harris said, his voice a mix of surprise and something else. "Was it fear? I didn't think I'd ever see you again." Max stared at him, trying to read his expression. Was this the man who had been involved in his family's death? The man who had helped the killer? Max's mind was a whirlwind of questions, but he had to keep his cool. "Why don't you tell me what happened that night?" Max asked, trying to sound calm, but his voice betrayed him. He could feel his anger rising. "Why was my family killed? What do you know about it?" Mr. Harris seemed to stiffen at the mention of the murder. His eyes darted away, avoiding Max's gaze. Max's pulse quickened. I don't know what you're talking about," Mr. Harris stammered, but there was something in his voice that didn't ring true. Max stepped forward, his jaw set. "I think you do." There was a long pause before Mr. Harris spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Max, you need to get out of here. You're not ready for this." Max's confusion deepened. What do you mean? What aren't you telling me? Mr. Harris took a deep breath, then looked Max square in the eye. You have no idea what you're getting yourself into. If you want the truth, you need to be ready for everything. The people who did this are still out there. And they won't stop until they get what they want. Max's mind reeled. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, but the truth was far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Before Max could respond, Mr. Harris pushed him out of the office, slamming the door shut behind him. Max stood there, in the cold, staring at the door, his mind racing. What had just happened? What did Mr. Harris know? What was he hiding? Max knew one thing for sure, this was no longer just about his family's murder. Something bigger was at play. And the more he searched for answers, the more danger he was in. But he wasn't going to stop, not now. The truth was out there, and he was determined to find it, no matter what it took. As he walked away from the garage, a feeling of dread washed over him. He couldn't shake the thought that someone was watching him, waiting for him to make his next move. And the truth? It was much closer than Max ever imagined.
Max barely slept that night. His mind raced through the conversation with Mr. Harris, the cryptic warnings, and the chilling words that still echoed in his ears. If you want the truth, you need to be ready for everything. Max had been ready for a long time, but the more he uncovered, the more he realized just how little he knew. What did Mr. Harris mean? Who were these people who wouldn't stop until they got what they want? The next morning, Max decided to meet with Detective Mills again. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. The detective's office felt suffocating as Max entered, a dark cloud hanging over him. Detective Mills was at his desk, reviewing a pile of paperwork when Max walked in. He glanced up, his face neutral, though Max could see the exhaustion in his eyes. The case had obviously been weighing on him as much as it had been on Max. Max, the detective greeted, gesturing for him to sit down. I was wondering when you'd be back. Got some new developments? Max didn't waste time. Mr. Harris, he said, his voice low. I spoke to him last night. He's hiding something, knows more than he's letting on. I need to know everything you have on him. You said we need to dig into his past. Do you have anything? The detective raised an eyebrow. Harris, you're sure about that? I mean, we already looked into him, but please, Max interrupted, frustration creeping into his tone. He was there that night. He was close to my father. There's something about him I can't shake, and I need to know what he's hiding. Detective Mills studied Max for a long moment before nodding slowly. All right, I'll pull up everything we've got. But Max, are you sure you're ready for this? The deeper you go, the more dangerous it gets. Max didn't hesitate. I don't care how dangerous it gets. I just want to know the truth. The detective stood up, walking over to a filing cabinet in the corner of the room. He flipped through some files, pulling out a manila folder and handing it over to Max. Hey, Race, what we've got on Mr. Harris. It's not much, but it's a start. Max opened the folder, scanning through the papers inside. There were reports of Harris' past, but they didn't give him the answers he was looking for. There were references to minor crimes, mostly fraud and theft, but nothing directly linking him to murder. He frowned. This was hardly what he had hoped for. What about the fire? Max asked, tapping the old news article he had found. The warehouse fire? Why was that connected to him? Detective Mills' face hardened slightly. The fire? It was suspicious, but no one could prove it was arson. There were too many conflicting stories. Harris was never charged. In fact, he managed to keep his name out of most of the media reports. He paused, his expression thoughtful. But you're right, it was odd, and it could be connected somehow. We need to dig deeper. Max nodded, his mind still racing. He had a feeling they were getting closer. Max left the police station with the weight of the folder in his hand, but the questions were still gnawing at him. As he stepped out into the street, a cold gust of wind made him shiver. But it wasn't the weather that unsettled him. It was the gnawing feeling that something was closing in on him. He didn't know who or what was watching him, but he could feel it. His eyes darted around, but the streets seemed empty, ordinary. Yet every passing car, every stranger walking down the street, felt like a potential threat. The paranoia was beginning to seep in, and Max hated how much it was consuming him. He headed towards the library, hoping to find more information on Harris and his connections. Maybe there were more clues hidden in plain sight that he hadn't seen yet. But as Max entered the quiet, dusty building, he had the distinct feeling that he was being followed. His heart skipped a beat as he glanced over his shoulder. There, just a few paces behind him, was a man in a dark coat. his face obscured by the collar. Max couldn't make out any features, but the man's presence sent a cold shiver down his spine. The man didn't seem to be in any rush, just kept pace with Max. Max quickened his pace, walking faster towards the rows of bookshelves. He wasn't sure why, but the feeling of being watched had grown stronger. He needed to lose this man. Max turned sharply into a narrow aisle between two rows of books. He walked briskly, praying that the stranger wouldn't follow. He pressed himself against the shelf, hoping to remain hidden. His breath came in shallow bursts, his mind racing. But when he peeked around the corner, the man was gone. Max's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't explain it. The man had disappeared, as if he had never been there at all. But Max knew what he had felt. Someone had been following him. Max grabbed a book at random from the shelf, trying to steady his nerves. He needed to calm down, focus. There was no reason to panic. It was probably nothing, just his mind playing tricks on him. But the feeling didn't fade. Max found a seat near the back of the library, opened the folder again, and began to read. The deeper he got into Harris' history, the more he realized that his suspicions were not unfounded. There were connections between Harris and several shady individuals who had ties to criminal organizations. He found references to stolen goods, underground dealings, and hidden accounts. Max's eyes widened as he pieced the puzzle together. It was no longer just about the murder of his family, it was something much bigger. Mr. Harris had been involved in far darker dealings than Max had ever imagined. But just as Max was about to read further, a sudden noise made him freeze. A loud thud echoed through the library, followed by the distinct sound of footsteps. Someone was approaching him, walking fast. Max's blood ran cold. He stuffed the folder into his bag and stood up, trying to make his way to the exit. But as he turned to leave, he collided with a man-tall figure who blocked his path. Max's heart raced. The man's face was familiar. It was the same man he had seen outside the police station, a man who had sent him the cryptic message earlier. The man smiled coldly, his eyes narrowing as he looked Max up and down. "You've been digging too deep, Max. You don't know what you're getting into." Max took a step back, his pulse pounding in his ears. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" The man didn't answer immediately. He leaned closer, his breath cold against Max's face. "If you want to survive this, you need to stop. Leave Harris alone. Leave everything alone and walk away. It's not worth it." Max felt a surge of anger. "I'm not walking away," he said, his voice steady. "I'm going to find the truth, no matter what it takes." The man's expression darkened, and before Max could react, the stranger grabbed his arm in a vice-like grip. "You're making a mistake, Max. You have no idea who you're up against. If you don't stop now, there will be consequences." Max jerked his arm away, heart pounding. "I don't care. I'm not scared of you." The man stepped back, his gaze lingering on Max. "You should be," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared into the aisles. Max stood frozen, his mind racing. Who was that man? What did he mean? And why was he so determined to stop Max from finding out the truth? The pieces were starting to fall into place, but Max could feel the walls closing in. He wasn't sure who to trust anymore. Everyone seemed to have their own hidden motives, and the more he uncovered, the more dangerous it became. Max left the library, his mind spinning. He knew one thing for sure. Whoever was behind this wasn't going to let him find the truth easily. But he wasn't ready to give up, not now. The next few days were a blur of unease and confusion. Max tried to process everything he had learned, but the more he delved into the past, the less he understood. He knew that Mr. Harris was at the center of this, but what exactly was he hiding? The man he had confronted at the library seemed to know more than he was letting on, and it left Max feeling vulnerable, exposed. Every corner he turned, there seemed to be more questions and fewer answers. Max barely slept, consumed by the thought of finding out the truth. The more he thought about it, the more it seemed like there were multiple layers to the mystery, each layer more dangerous than the last. He felt like he was caught in a web, and no matter how hard he pulled, the strands only tightened around him. The old mechanic's garage had always felt like a safe place for Max, but now it was tainted with suspicion. Mr. Harris had been there that night, talking to his father, sharing beers, laughing like old friends. But now everything about Harris felt wrong. Max couldn't shake the feeling that the man knew more than he had let on, that his friendship with his father had been a facade. Max's footsteps echoed in the empty garage as he walked past the old cars that lined the bays. It was late at night, and the garage was as quiet as a tomb. He had come back here, not just for answers, but because he couldn't escape the feeling that something important was hidden in these walls. He had tried to contact Detective Mills again, but the man seemed distant, cold even. It was as if he didn't want to share information with Max anymore. There was a strange hesitation in the detective's voice when they spoke, as though he was hiding something himself. Max couldn't figure it out, but he knew he had to keep pushing. Max's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He pulled it out, staring at the screen. It was a message FR. OM, an unknown number. His heart skipped a beat as he opened it. You're getting too close. Max stopped looking. There's more at risk than you know. Max's stomach turned. Was it the same person who had been following him? Who was trying to warn him, and why? The message felt like a threat, but at the same time, it was as if someone was trying to protect him from the danger he was about to walk into. His fingers trembled as he typed back. Who is this? But no reply came. His mind raced as he shoved the phone back in his pocket. He was losing control. The deeper he went, the more it seemed like people were trying to scare him away. But Max wasn't the type to back down. He couldn't stop now, not after everything that had happened. The next day, Max visited the local archives. The old building smelled of dust and old paper, the kind of place where time seemed to stand still. Max had always hated coming here as a guide, preferred the freedom of the outdoors, not the suffocating silence of dusty shelves. But now, it felt like the only place where he could find answers. He had spent hours searching for any connection between Mr. Harris and his family's murder. But every new lead seemed to fizzle out before he could get any concrete information. The police had already looked into the case, but their investigation seemed to have stalled years ago. No one had been arrested, and no one had ever been charged. The case had grown cold. Max didn't know why he expected things to be different, but he refused to give up. He couldn't stop, not with all the strange things happening around him. Someone was following him. Someone was sending him cryptic messages. And someone was trying to scare him into stopping his investigation. As he flipped through a particularly thick folder of old documents, a name caught his eye: Robert Hale. Max had never heard of him before, but there was something about the name that seemed familiar. He dug through the folder until he found a police report from several years ago, detailing an investigation into a robbery that had occurred at a local warehouse. The man named in the report, Robert Hale, was connected to a group of individuals with ties to organized crime. The report mentioned his involvement in a string of illegal activities that were eerily similar to the things Max had read about in Mr. Harris' past. Max's heart skipped a beat. He had never seen this name before, but something about it made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Later that evening, Max decided to go to the one place he had always avoided, the old house where his family had lived. It felt wrong to be there. The house was empty now, its once warm and welcoming walls now cold and hollow. But Max couldn't escape the feeling that he was supposed to be there. He needed to find out more, to see if there were any clues left behind. The house had been sold after his family's death, and the new owners hadn't bothered to make any changes. It looked almost the same, with the same pictures hanging on the walls, the same furniture in place. Max wandered through the rooms, his footsteps quiet on the wooden floors. He paused in the hallway, staring at a photograph of his parents and himself, taken when he was just a little boy. The memories seemed so distant now. He had always been close to his parents, his father especially. He could still remember the sound of his father's laughter, the way he had always made him feel safe, like nothing could ever hurt them. But that was all gone now. All he had left were these empty rooms and unanswered questions. Max's gaze wandered to the bookshelf in the living room. He walked over and began to sift through the old books, one by one. His hand stopped at a leather-bound journal, its cover worn with age. It looked familiar, like something his father might have kept. Max pulled it off the shelf, flipping it open to the first page. The writing was his father's, neat and precise. Max's fingers trembled as he read. The journal detailed his father's thoughts, his observations on the business, and mentions of Mr. Harris. As he skimmed through the pages, one particular entry stood out. Harris is getting too close to some dangerous people. I'm not sure how much longer I can keep this from Max. Max's breath caught in his throat. What did that mean? What had his father been hiding? Had Mr. Harris been involved in something even worse than he had imagined? And why had his father never told him? Max couldn't read anymore. The answers were too painful, too much to bear. He slammed the journal shut, his mind reeling. It was as if his father had known something that Max wasn't supposed to know. But what was it? What had been going on behind closed doors? Max left the house quickly, the weight of the journal still heavy in his bag. His mind was racing, and he felt a deep sense of dread settling in his chest. As he walked through the quiet streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following him again. His eyes darted over his shoulder, but all he saw was the empty road. But then he heard a sound of footsteps behind him. Max's heart pounded. He didn't need to look to know someone was there. He quickened his pace, his breath shallow and fast. He needed to get to safety. He turned a corner, hoping to lose whoever was behind him, but the footsteps grew louder. Whoever it was getting closer. Max didn't stop. He couldn't afford to. Finally, he reached a dead-end alley, and in that moment, he knew there was nowhere left to run. He spun around, ready to face whatever was coming. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and imposing. It was the man from the library, the one who had warned him before. "You should have listened," the man said, his voice cold. "You've crossed the line, Max. Now there's no turning back." Max took a step back, his hand reaching into his bag for the journal. He wasn't about to back down now. "What do you want from me?" Max demanded. "Why are you doing this?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he took another step forward, his face now visible in the dim light. And for the first time, Max recognized him. It was Robert Hale, the name he had found in the report at the library. Max's blood ran cold. Max's breath caught in his throat as he stood frozen, facing the man who had appeared out of nowhere. Pt1, the same name he had read in his father's journal and the police report. The connection between him and Mr. Harris was clearer now, and it was a connection that Max hadn't anticipated. Hale had been involved in his father's life far more than he had realized, and that meant the danger surrounding him wasn't just about uncovering the truth, it was about surviving it. Max took a step back, clutching the journal tighter, the weight of it now feeling like a burden he wasn't sure he could carry. "Why are you here?" Max demanded, his voice shaking despite his best efforts to sound firm. "What do you want from me?" Hale didn't speak immediately. Instead, he studied Max with an unreadable expression. The moonlight cast long shadows over his face, making him appear even more menacing. For a moment, Max wondered if he should run, but he knew there was nowhere to go. The alley was narrow, and the man in front of him was blocking the only escape. "I don't think you fully understand, Max," Hale said finally, his voice low and slow. "The truth you're chasing is much bigger than you can handle. People like Harris, people like me, we don't just walk away. We don't let people get in our way." Max's mind raced. He could barely comprehend what Hale was saying. People like him? Like Harris? Were they connected to his family's murder in some way? Why had they been involved with his father? Max tried to steady his breath, his mind working furiously. "I want to know what happened to my family," he said, each word coming out more forcefully than he felt. "I want to know why my parents are dead, and why you're threatening me." Hale's lips curled into a cold smile. "You're not ready for this, Max, but you will be, soon enough." Before Max could react, Hale moved forward, grabbing him by the arm with Sue. Reprising strength, Max tried to yank his arm away, but Hale's grip was like iron. "Come with me," Hale growled. "You're going to get answers, whether you like it or not." Max's mind raced. He couldn't go with Hale. There was something about this man that felt wrong, dangerously wrong. But as Hale tightened his grip, Max knew he had no choice but to go along. He needed to understand what was going on, even if it meant walking deeper into the darkness. The two men walked through the alley and out into the main street, where Hale led Max to an old van parked by the side. The van was nondescript, the kind of vehicle that blended in with the surroundings. No one would notice it unless they were looking for it, which made Max wonder just how often Hale had used it. The doors creaked open, and Max was pushed inside. The interior was dim, lit only by the weak glow of a single light overhead. There were no windows in the back, and the air smelled stale, like it hadn't been ventilated in days. Max sat down, heart racing. His fingers clenched the journal so tightly his knuckles turned white. Hale slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. The van rumbled to life, and they drove off, the street lights flickering past them as they made their way into the outskirts of town. Max had no idea where they were going, but he knew it couldn't be good. Everything about this situation screamed danger. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Hale pulled the van into a secluded industrial area. It was dark, the streets barely lit, and the only sound was the hum of distant machinery. The buildings here were old and run down, abandoned warehouses that seemed to have been forgotten by time. Max's gut twisted. Whatever was about to happen, he didn't think he was going to like it. The van came to a stop, and Hale turned to look at Max, his expression cold and unreadable. "Get out," he ordered. Max hesitated for a moment, but then pushed open the door and stepped out into the cold night air. He had no choice. If he wanted answers, he had to follow Hale. But every step he took felt like he was walking deeper into a trap, and the fear in his chest grew with each passing second. Hale led Max into one of the warehouses, the heavy metal doors creaking as they swung open. Inside, it was pitch black except for a faint light coming from somewhere deep within. Max's eyes slowly adjusted to the dim surroundings, and he could make out the outlines of old machinery and boxes stacked haphazardly against the walls. "Stay close," Hale said, his voice low. "This place is full of people who wouldn't think twice about hurting you." Max's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't respond. His mind was focused entirely on the dark figure that stood in front of him. He could feel it pull of something heavy, something that didn't belong in the world he knew. They walked deeper into the warehouse, and Max's eyes eventually caught sight of a group of people gathered around a small, makeshift table. There were 4 of them, all men, wearing dark clothing and looking out of place in the desolate building. The air was thick with tension, and the men barely acknowledged Hale as they continued their conversation. At the far end of the table sat a man who stood out from the rest. He was older, with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor. He looked like someone in control, someone who didn't need to raise his voice to command respect. Max could feel the weight of his gaze, and it sent a chill down his spine. Hale walked up to the man, nodding slightly. "This is him," he said, his voice serious. "Max Carter. He's been asking too many questions." The man at the table didn't move at first. He simply stared at Max, his eyes calculating, as though weighing him, judging him. Max felt as though he were under a mic. Roscope, every detail of his being scrutinized. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Finally, the man spoke. "So, you're the one, the son of Richard Carter." Max's stomach dropped. He had heard his father's name come up before in all the research he had done, but hearing it now, spoken by this man, made everything feel suddenly real, suddenly dangerous. "I've been looking for the truth," Max said, his voice wavering but determined. "I want to know why my family was murdered. Why were you involved?" The man smiled faintly, but it was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Involved?" he repeated, as if the word were foreign to him. "I was never involved, Max, but your father certainly was. He made a choice, and now you're here, trying to undo everything he did." Max felt the blood drain from his face. "What do you mean? What did my father do?" The man leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Your father was mixed up with the wrong people. People like me, people who play by their own rules. He thought he could change things, but in the end, he betrayed us, and we had to make an example out of him." Max's world tilted. Betrayed them? What was he talking about? His father had never been the type to betray anyone. He was kind, honest, hardworking. Max's entire life had been built on the image of his father as a hero. But now, that image was shattering before his eyes. "What do you mean? What did he do?" Max demanded, feeling a surge of anger rise within him. "My father would never betray anyone." The man's expression softened, but only slightly. "It's not about what he wanted to do, Max. It's about what he had to do. He owed us. He was part of something much bigger than you can understand. And now, so are you." Max's heart raced, and his mind felt foggy. He couldn't piece the puzzle together. Not yet. But one thing was clear. He had walked into something far deeper, far darker than age he could have ever imagined. And now, there was no turning back. Max's breath caught in his throat as the words echoed in his mind. He owed us. He was part of something much bigger than you can understand. And now, so are you. The man's cold eyes held Max's, almost as if daring him to challenge his words. Every fiber of Max's being screamed to turn and run, to escape this nightmare before it consumed him entirely. But deep down, a burning need for answers kept him rooted to the spot. His father had been involved in something he didn't understand, and now Max was caught up in it too. "Who are you?" Max asked, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and defiance. "What is this? What are you really saying?" The man leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. His gaze remained steady, calculating, like he was looking right through Max. "I think you already know the answer to that, Max. Your father was part of an organization, one that operated in the shadows, doing the dirty work that no one else wanted to. And he wasn't the only one. There are more people out there. People who knew how to play the game. People who knew how to get things done. People who kept things quiet." Max's mind whirled as he tried to process the words. His father a part of an organization? A part of a secret group involved in criminal activities? The thought was too much. It didn't fit with the man he remembered, the loving father who had taught him how to fix an engine, who had shown him the world in a way that made everything feel safe. But now, everything had changed. The comfortable reality Max had lived in for all these years had cracked open, revealing a darkness he couldn't comprehend. "I don't believe you," Max said, shaking his head. He had to deny it, had to hold on to the version of his father he had known. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they rang hollow. He was beginning to realize that the truth was something he couldn't escape, no matter how much he wanted to. The man's lips twitched, almost as if he were amused by Max's resistance. "You can deny it all you want, but the truth is still the truth, Max. Your father was in over his head, and so are you." Max took a step back, his chest tightening. "What do you mean, so am I? What does that have to do with me?" The man uncrossed his arms and leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You think this is all just coincidence? Your father's death, your search for answers, all of it? No, Max, it's far from it. You've been dragged into this world whether you like it or not. They'll be coming for you soon." Max's heart pounded. "Who's coming for me?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he rose from his chair, the room suddenly feeling much smaller. "You've made a lot of enemies by digging into things you shouldn't have. People don't like it when their secrets come to light, Max. People like us, we have ways of making sure things stay buried." "Who are you?" Max repeated, his voice trembling now. "And what is this organization?" The man smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it, only the cold, unfeeling expression of someone who had long since lost any sense of morality. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you. All you need to know is that we have our hands in everything. The government, the police, business. We pull the strings behind the scenes, making sure things run smoothly. And your father, he was a part of that." Max felt like the floor was giving way beneath him. He had been raised to believe that the world was black and white, that good people did good things and bad people did bad things. His father had always been the embodiment of that, his hero, his protector. But now Max was beginning to see the cracks, the gray areas that had been hidden from him. "But why?" Max managed to croak. "Why didn't he tell me? Why didn't he warn me about any of this?" The man sighed, as if the question was an old one he had answered countless times before. "Because your father didn't want you to be part of this world, Max. He tried to keep you safe, but when you're involved with people like us, there are no easy exits. He thought he could get out, but that's not how it works. You can't just walk away." Max's head spun. The man's words felt like a punch to the gut. His father had been trapped. He had been trying to protect Max, even if it meant hiding the truth from him. But now Max was caught in the same web. He couldn't escape. The past was coming back to claim him, and there was nowhere left to hide. "So, what now?" Max asked, the words slipping out before he could stop them. The man stepped forward, placing a hand on Max's shoulder. The touch was cold like ice. Now you join us. Max, you've already started down this path. There's no turning back now. You'll either learn to survive, or you'll get swallowed whole." Max recoiled from the touch, his heart racing. This was all happening too fast. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't prepared for this new reality, where his father's death, the man in front of him, and everything he thought he knew about the world were all part of something much darker. But as the man's words hung in the air, Max knew there was no way out. He was already in too deep, and if he wanted to survive, if he wanted to find out the truth about what had happened to his family, he had no choice but to follow the dangerous path ahead. As they walked back out into the night, Max felt a sense of dread weigh heavily in his chest. The warehouse loomed behind him, a shadow in the darkness, and the air felt thick with secrets. Hale had driven the van back into the heart of the city, where everything was illuminated by the harsh glow of STR. Eat lights. Max's mind buzzed with everything he had just learned, but his stomach churned. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being dragged into something far beyond his control. "Where are we going?" Max asked, his voice low, as though he could somehow stop the truth from coming out. "You'll see," Hale said cryptically, his eyes focused on the road. He was speaking as if nothing in the world could shake his composure. Max hated it. He hated how calm Hale was, how in control he seemed, as if this whole nightmare was nothing more than another day at work. They finally stopped at a small, run-down diner at the edge of town. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting an eerie light across the empty parking lot. The diner was nearly empty, save for a few tired-looking truck drivers sitting at the counter, sipping their coffee in silence. Hale motioned for Max to follow him inside, and Max reluctantly obeyed. The bell above the door jingled as they entered, and the sound seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet space. The waitress behind the counter barely looked up, her tired eyes scanning the menu. Hale sat down at one of the booths, and Max slid into the seat across from him, feeling like he was sinking into the shadows that seemed to cling to this place. "We'll be meeting someone soon," Hale said, his voice low and purposeful. "Someone who can help you understand what you're dealing with." Max didn't know whether to feel more afraid or curious. He didn't want to know more, didn't want to understand the depths of the danger surrounding him. But his need for answers was stronger. He had to know. He had to understand why his father had been involved with these people and what had really happened that night. As Hale sat back, a dark figure emerged from the shadows, and Max's heart skipped a beat. Another person was coming to add more pieces to the puzzle, and Max had a sinking feeling that his piece was the one that would finally bring the whole truth into the light. The figure emerged from the shadows at the far end of the diner, and Max's pulse quickened. He wasn't sure whether to feel fear or anticipation. He had been led to believe that there was someone here who could answer his questions, someone who could explain everything. But something about the way the figure moved made Max's instinct scream. This was not going to be a conversation filled with comfort or reassurance. The man, dressed in a dark coat and a fedora, walked with slow, deliberate steps. As he approached, he looked straight at Max, and for the first time in a long while, Max felt a chill run down his spine. There was a certain coldness to the way this person looked at him, as if Max was nothing more than a piece in a game he didn't understand. Hale stood up from the booth as the man reached their table. He greeted him with a nod, but there was no warmth in it, just the same cold professionalism that Max had begun to despise. "This is Max," Hale said, gesturing toward him. "He's the son of Richard Carter. He's asking questions." Max didn't speak at first, studying the man carefully. The stranger's face was sharp, with hard eyes that seemed to bore into him. Max could tell immediately that this man wasn't like the others he had encountered. This wasn't just a thug or a hired muscle. This man had power, and with power came danger. "Max Carter," the man said, his voice low, smooth, and oddly detached. "I've been expecting you." Max couldn't help but feel a shiver run through him. "You've been expecting me?" he repeated, his voice rising slightly in disbelief. "Why? What do you want from me?" The man took a seat across from Max, his movements calculated, as though he were perfectly at ease in a situation that was clearly tense. "I'm here to offer you the truth, Max. The whole truth. But I'm not sure you're ready for it." Max felt his stomach tighten at the words. "I'm ready," he said, almost fiercely. "Why?" "I've spent my whole life searching for answers. I need to know what happened to my parents. I need to know why they're dead." The man studied him for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. It was like he was trying to gauge whether Max had the strength to handle the weight of the information he was about to deliver. Max felt the tension building, but there was no turning back now. "I'm going to tell you everything you need to know," the man said finally. "But first, you need to understand something. Your father wasn't just an ordinary man. He was part of a very powerful network, one that controlled much of what happened behind closed doors. There were decisions that had to be made, things that couldn't be avoided, no matter how much he tried to protect you from them." Max swallowed hard, struggling to comprehend what the man was saying. "What kind of network? What decisions?" The man leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. "It's called the Circle. It's an organization that operates on the fringes of society, with its hands in politics, business, law enforcement everywhere. They control what you see, what you hear, and what you don't. Your father was a key player in that network." Max felt his mind spin as the words hit him. His father had been part of something like this? Something this big? It was hard to grasp, impossible to reconcile with the man he had known. His father had been a man of integrity, someone who would never have willingly entered a life of corruption. So how had he become involved with something so sinister? "You're lying," Max said, shaking his head. "My father would never be a part of something like that." The man's lips curled into a faint smile, but it wasn't comforting. "You don't want to believe it, but it's the truth. Your father was involved with the Circle long before you were born. He tried to leave, tried to get out of it. But there's no such thing as leaving once you in." Max slammed his fist down on the table, frustration building inside him. "Why didn't he tell me? Why didn't he warn me?" The man's eyes softened, but only briefly. "He did warn you. In his own way. He kept you away from it. But there's only so much he could do. You've been asking too many questions, Max. People like you don't survive in this world if you keep asking questions." Max leaned back in his chair, the weight of the man's words sinking in. "What do you mean? Are you threatening me?" The man didn't flinch. "It's not a threat. It's a fact. There are forces at play here, forces that you can't even begin to understand. The circle doesn't take kindly to people poking around in their business. And now that you're involved, they'll be coming for you. They'll be coming for all of you. Max's heart raced as a new wave of fear washed over him. What do you want from me? He asked, his voice strained. I'm not here to want anything from you, the man said, his tone cold and matter-of-fact. I'm here to offer you a choice. A way out. Max's brow furrowed. A way out? What are you talking about? The man leaned in closer. You have two choices, Max. You can join us, become a part of the circle. You can help us, and in turn, we can help you. We can keep you safe. Or you can continue down this path, asking questions, uncovering secrets that will get you killed. And everyone you care about will be dragged down with you. Max felt a knot form in his stomach. The weight of the decision was overwhelming. The truth had never seemed so dangerous. His mind raced with the implications of what the man was saying. He had spent his whole life believing in right and wrong, in justice. But now, everything was in shades of gray. There was no clear answer, no easy path forward. He could join them, become a part of the very thing that had destroyed his family, or he could keep fighting and risk losing everything. I want join. You, Max said through gritted teeth, though his voice faltered slightly. I won't become like them. I can't. The man didn't seem surprised by Max's refusal. He simply nodded. I expected that answer. But you should know, Max, there's a price to pay for defying the circle. And it's a price you can't afford to pay. I can't protect you from what's coming. Max stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. Then I'll face it on my own, he said, his voice shaking but firm. They'll find out the truth. They'll make sure they don't win. The man's eyes glinted with something that Max couldn't quite place. A mixture of pity and something else, something colder. Well, see, Max. Well, see. Max turned to leave, but as he stepped toward the door, the man's voice stopped him. Remember, Max, the man called after him. The circle is everywhere. There's nowhere you can run. Max's heart pounded in his chest as he walked out of the diner, the weight of his decision settling on him. He didn't know if he could survive in this dangerous new world. But one thing was clear, wasn't going to stop. No matter what came next, he would find the truth. And he would make sure those responsible for his family's death would pay. As the cold night air hit him, Max knew that the battle for his life was just beginning. And in the end, he would have to decide whether the truth was worth the cost.